Okay. So welcome everyone. Again, if you're just coming in, please share your name, introduce yourself into the chat, where you're coming from. Um, if you know your land acknowledgement, please share that as well. And then a little bit about what brings you here today, and we'll keep going. So I'll do a quick intro and then hand it over to Ian. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Valerie. My pronouns are she and they. I am the Director of Strategy and Education at Rooted, and run sort of all of these roundtables in our cohorts and things like that is sort of the area that I focus on. I'm coming today from Chichenyo Ohlone land here in the San Francisco East Bay. And I'm just excited to be here with you all today and see what's fruitful for everyone. Ian?
Hey, I'm Ian Madrigal. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an independent campaign consultant, but I also am a trainer and facilitator with the Center for Story-Based Strategy, which does this kind of narrative training work that we're going to get into today. And for folks that were here for narrative training part 1, my colleague Kiara also works with the Center for Story-Based Strategy.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a little bit of Zoom etiquette that's maybe obvious for everyone at this point, but we've done a lot of these, and so what's on this slide is here for a reason. Just be aware of your camera angle, make sure you're always fully clothed. Please use your name or organization so that when people are in breakouts, they have some association of who you are. Include your pronouns and then keep your mic on mute other than the times when we ask you to unmute to share thoughts and information with us. And so for those who don't know us, we are Rooted, and we are an organization that focuses on nonprofit communications and really thinking about communications and technology as they can advance equity across our systems, and that we can use this work we do together to create more anti-racist spaces for us all. And so we're really, again, happy that you're joining us here today to take some time out of your busy schedules and have some time to be together and think strategically and hopefully make some new networked friends as well. We focus all of our work in the Design Justice Network principles. And for those who aren't familiar, you can click on this slide if you've opened it yourself. But this idea of really using design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as seek liberation from exploitive and oppressive systems, is really at the core of all of our work. If you don't think of yourself as a designer, now is the time. That's really the work that you're doing here today and that you probably do in your work all the time. And so really trying to center that work into how we can dismantle oppression together is the key to what we want to be doing in the world. So here are a couple of our community agreements. I'll go through them quickly but slowly enough for you to sort of absorb them. So approach with curiosity, be open to new ways of thinking and doing, sit with discomfort, accept and accept non-disclosure. Through all of this work, there'll always be moments where you may not know something or something's new, or you just aren't sure what the next right step is, and be okay and sit with that. You'll find it in time. It will reveal itself. Engage and be present. Practice mindful listening. Be aware of power dynamics. Consider the space you consume and share space. Speak from your experience, assume best intent, and acknowledge the impact of your words on others. This one I think is always a really important one. We want to come into this space that it is a safe space for all of us, but that it's also a necessary space. So really, it's not giving anyone a hall pass to say whatever they'd like, but that you should be speaking from your experience, but also being as aware as you possibly can of how your identity and biases may play into what you're saying, and so that you can acknowledge the impact that may have on somebody else. And skipping down to number 8, be willing to slow down, notice, and name what might be coming up in the room so that we can really come together and move through any moments of challenge. Ideate, back up to number 6, ideate yes, and embrace being messy. Put aside perfectionism. This is a space to test things, to try things out, to experiment. And really, I hope you can embrace that and try and move yourself to someplace new. And what's shared here stays here, and what's learned here leaves here. And then to number 9, take care of yourself and have fun. And just to open it up for a moment, is there anything else people would like to add to that? Okay. Then along those same lines of what's shared here stays here, we like to think about this through the Chatham House rule that participants are free to share the information they've received, but not the identity or the affiliation of the speaker, or that of any other participant may be revealed. And I would say that's leaving here. And you should also, when you're in your breakouts, talk about that of whether you're okay with naming if someone has said something specifically within your group, or whether you'd prefer that to stay anonymous when you bring back any of your sort of ideas back to the larger group to share out in the larger space. So with that, I will hand it over to Ian.
Great. And so this is basically our agenda for the day. Remarkably, we are actually running ahead of schedule despite the delay. So we planned this well. Thanks again, everyone, for your patience with the technical issues. So yeah, first 20 minutes, welcome and community agreements. The next 25 minutes will be my presentation. We're going to go over the narrative tools of the drama triangle and points of intervention. Then we're going to give all of you about 10 minutes for individual writing and reflection to kind of think about the tools you just learned and how they might apply to your work. And then we'll have 45 minutes for the solution room where you can play around with these new tools and collaborate with each other about ideas that are coming up for you. Then we'll leave for 10 minutes for a large group share out and another 10 for closing and tools. And we'll be out of here in time for a very early lunch. So I'll get into the narrative tools. I also realized I forgot to mention I am based in Baltimore, which is Piscataway land. And I'm originally from Long Beach, California. So for those who were able to attend narrative training part 1, my colleague Kiara went over elements of story. If you weren't here, I'll just do a really brief recap. Basically, the elements of story are kind of what we all think of when we think of stories. Maybe you learned this in English class in 9th grade, but like conflict, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? How's it being framed? Who's the conflict between? Characters, who are the folks that we're actually paying attention to in this story? Who are the messengers? Did they get to tell their own story, or are they being talked about? Imagery, we always encourage folks to show, not tell the readers. So think about powerful images, really specific symbols or metaphors that will help carry your story along. Foreshadowing, what does the story suggest about the end or the future? And then underlying assumptions. That's the part that we maybe don't think about as traditionally, but what are the unstated assumptions that someone would have to believe in order to accept your story as true? Because that's often the barrier, even just coming into a story, is if it challenges one of your personal assumptions that you live your life by, the moment it happens, you might just turn off and stop listening to the story. So we want to be aware of specifically the underlying assumptions that our audience might be bringing to the space and think about how we might want to challenge them. So today we're going to move into the drama triangle. It's also a pretty, I think, easy to understand concept, but really for me has helped shift how I think about narrative and how I want to frame new stories that I'm trying to tell. So go to the next slide. The drama triangle is basically the traditional kind of character conflict setup in stories. And we think about it in terms of like, who's the hero, who's the victim, who's the villain. And obviously these are kind of outdated terms, but this is because this is such a classic story technique. And one of the tools we're going to be, or one of the ways we're going to be using the drama triangle is to actually challenge kind of the assumption that there's always going to be these 3 characters in the story. So you can probably imagine how this would play out in various examples of social justice conversations, but I'm going to bring it back down to just simple storytelling. And so I'll give you an example of the drama triangle in terms of The Lion King. If you want to go to the next slide. So here we see the movie poster for The Lion King. I'm assuming most folks are at least fairly familiar with that story. But even on the movie poster, you can see that we have Mufasa and Simba up at the top as the heroes. We have the female lions and maybe the baby lions as the victims of the story. And then we have Scar and the hyenas as the villains. And that's really the way the story has traditionally been told. But what if that's not the whole story? What if there's something going on here that Disney's not telling us? So an example of how we can use the drama triangle to kind of shift the tension, shift the power, and shift the perspective is, let's say that there's a different story. There's a lion named Mufasa, and from a very young age, he demonstrated feminine behavior. He sat with the female lions, he groomed, he made crafts. He started to question if he even was male or female. Maybe he felt somewhere in between. And his father, who was king at the time, was really disappointed. He was supposed to be his successor, the new king, but he was not manly enough. He didn't exhibit the traits that his father wanted to see in him. So Mufasa and his father had a fight one day. His father scratched him across the face and left him with a scar and said, "I take your name." He took his firstborn's name and gave it to his secondborn son. So now Scar, nameless, disowned by his family, he leaves Pride Rock and he goes and joins the hyenas. As he lives with the hyenas for several years, he learns that Pride Rock was actually hyena territory just 2 generations ago, and the lions had kicked them out. And so now Scar has organized with the hyenas. He decides they want to take back Pride Rock and care for it in the sustainable ways that they've been doing for hundreds of years before the lions came around. He pledges commitment to return stewardship of Pride Rock to the hyenas and take on the lion colonizers. So that's a very different story than Disney tells us, right? And that's a way of reframing who's the hero, who's the villain, who's the victim. If you want to go to the next slide, we can kind of look at that on the drama triangle so you can think about how it's different. So in this characterization, Scar is now the hero, the victims are now the hyenas, the villain is Mufasa and the other lions. But we can complicate this even more. That's, again, kind of a simplistic way to think about it. We don't need a singular hero, right? Like, that's kind of the traditional narrative in Western literature, is like one hero swoops in and saves the day. But we can complicate that by saying Scar organized with the hyenas. They are also their own heroes. They're their own liberators. A big way that we like to use the drama triangle is to think about how can we move the folks that are the victims into the position of the hero, because we want people to be empowered to save themselves, not be saved by some outside force. And then, Pride Rock itself could be a character. It could be a victim in the story of colonization. So the drama triangle really is just a way of thinking about where the power lies in your story and who you can choose to empower and who you can choose to make a clear villain. I think one big mistake that a lot of folks make when they're thinking about their story and thinking about the different heroes and villains and victims is actually not naming a clear villain. A lot of times, we'll have the villain be kind of an abstract concept like corporate greed or capitalism, or just maybe we don't even name it at all. Maybe it's just some unseen evil force, when we use that kind of passive language, right? And so I think it's really powerful when we can name an actual villain. It doesn't always have to be an actual person, but we at least want to be as specific as possible of who is in the way here. And I think the other power of the drama triangle is you have the drama triangle of your problem, but you also have your drama triangle of your solution. And I think you can take someone who currently might be the villain in your story and give them an opportunity to step in the role of hero. So that can be the kind of vision that you lay out is, yes, we're saying that, maybe this corrupt landlord or this police department or whatever it is our villain right now. But here is what we are asking them to do to give them the opportunity to no longer be the villain. And that can be really powerful. So that's the drama triangle. Next, I'm going to get into points of intervention. So a question, is there a way to move beyond hero, victim, villain approaches to a format that has great views of all the actors? I definitely think so. I will say, when you're designing a campaign and you want to kind of engage an audience quickly, it is, I think, a useful tool to have people in those three spots. It's a little bit harder to, get your message across if it's unclear who's playing particular roles, just because it's such a like common frame in Western storytelling. But I think it can be really powerful to start off with kind of a traditional drama triangle story and then shift with your vision of the future to make it a little bit more gray, like recognizing the situation as it is now, but giving everyone a chance to play a role in liberation. Great. So points of intervention. Actually, if you can go back one slide. So how do we challenge the dominant story? Points of intervention are basically places in a system where we can intervene to change the story. They're vulnerabilities that we can exploit where the dominant stories are already weak. So I think this tool is particularly helpful in planning specific actions. We want to think about which part, particularly of our opponent's story, that we want to complicate and reframe. So that's where the drama triangle can come in helpfully as well. You can think about your drama triangle that you're trying to tell, and then also your opponent's drama triangle, and how do we want to intervene and complicate their narrative. Okay, next slide. So there are 5 different types of points of intervention, and it's kind of just a way to like think through the actions that you want to plan, the protests, the events, or even just the stories that you want to tell. So the first type is point of production. And that's thinking about where are things made related to the issues you want to work on. So that could be, like this example, Mexico protests Monsanto with the Carnival of Corn, croplands, like literally where food is produced, we're intervening there to demonstrate how, in this case, Monsanto is damaging people's livelihoods. It could also be like a factory where things are made. You can imagine like strikes and picket lines are interventions at the point of production. So that's where a lot of traditional types of protests would go. The next type is the point of destruction. So this is where are people, places, things destroyed related to the issues we want to work on. And we can think about that really literally in terms of like resource extraction, logging, mining, points of toxic discharge, road blockades, that kind of thing. You can imagine like the Dakota Access Pipeline protests would be intervening at point of destruction. And then this example here is actually a light installation in a Scottish coastal town, which shows where the future sea level is going to be with climate change. So a lot of climate change protests you can imagine would be at the point of destruction, showing where things are going to be destroyed in coming years. The next one is point of consumption. This is a big opportunity in American culture where we're so focused on consuming things all the time. So this is anywhere where customers could be reached. So this could be ads, this could be chain stores, supermarkets. This is more the realm of consumer boycotts and marketing campaigns. So in this example, we see that the supermarket removed all foreign food from the shelves to make a point about racism. And this is a German supermarket. So the consumers walk in and see that like very little of their food actually comes from this country. And so the message is to be less xenophobic to folks coming from elsewhere because they enrich our lives. The next one is point of decision. And this is a very popular way to intervene. Think about like the location of your targeted decision maker. So that could be Congress, it could be your local like state legislative offices, could be the governor's mansion, corporate headquarters, slumlord's office, courthouse, anything where someone in power is making a decision and you want to influence that person specifically, or maybe indirectly influence that person by embarrassing them in front of the public or some other target that might be influential to them. So this example is actually from my own work. I do a lot of creative activism, and this was when I was working on a campaign against big banks and lenders, and basically dressed up as the monopoly man and sat behind a CEO while he testified to Congress. And so that is kind of a creative way to get in at the point of intervention or the point of decision, get in front of the cameras and make a difference, hopefully in front of lawmakers. Next, we have point of assumption. I think point of assumption is a particularly powerful one because it's really like almost all of these other examples you can also think of as being point of assumption, right? Like if we want to think about me dressing up as the Monopoly man and photobombing a CEO, that's challenging your assumption of who is going to be in a congressional hearing, right? Um, it's challenging kind of the decorum of the place. So for point of assumption, you're challenging those underlying assumptions back in the elements of story that the audience has that you need to complicate in order to move your story forward. So one example of challenging at a point of assumption would be complicating the drama triangle, would be seeing characters as more gray instead of black and white. That's one way to challenge people's assumptions. A lot of times when we think about planning interventions at the point of assumption, we want to think about pop culture trends, regular celebrations in your area, anything to kind of like get in front of people, because point of assumption, you really want to think about it being visible to the most people and really being easily translatable. So pop culture is often a very effective way to challenge people's assumptions because it's a language that we all speak. So this example here is a Twitter feed that turns Trump's tweets into supervillain comics. It's very, very effective. And it's another example of just, you might not think that comic books are going to have a serious political message. You'd be very wrong, but some people do think that. And also, I think it challenges the assumption that a president isn't going to sound like a comic book villain. But I think, this example, this artist shows how much we really have gotten numb, I think, to the way that Trump speaks. And he shows just how absurd and over the top and comically evil it is. So those are the points of intervention. The way that you want to use this tool, I think, is to think about where you can intervene in your issue. So, again, if you're working on climate change, you want to think about where is climate change actually happening, where is the destruction happening, and plan your intervention there. If you're working on workers' rights, you want to think about organizing protests or strikes or events at factories, at the place where those workers are actually working. Maybe they're picking food. Point of consumption, if you're trying to reach consumers, obviously that's a very effective way. But even if you're not specifically targeting your audience as consumers, just thinking about the fact that American culture is so centered around consumption that you can organize outside of a mall, outside of a store, even if your issue is not actually about those things. And also you want to think about how you can hijack marketing and ads, which are just everywhere, to target your issue. Point of decision, again, like super classic. Anytime you're influencing a decision maker, you want to think about that. But I would encourage, folks who, like, sometimes I think it's our knee-jerk reaction to organize an intervention at the point of decision. But you want to think about who you ultimately really want to influence. Like sometimes getting, in front of a legislator is the most effective thing, but a lot of times actually ginning up the public to reach out to the legislator is a lot more effective because you have that mass amount of people. So then you want to think, okay, am I reaching my audience of constituents by going straight to the legislative office, or can I reach them in a different way? And then point of assumption, just be really clear about your opponent's drama triangle, your opponent's story, and how you can challenge those assumptions so that their story kind of falls apart. So that's a lot of stuff to cover. I know it's a lot to take in, especially if you haven't done this kind of narrative strategy work before, but I hope that it gives you kind of some initial thoughts sparking that might be helpful to you. And so now we're just going to take about 10 minutes to do some individual writing and reflection. So take that all in, feel free to review the slides. Most of the information I went over is on the slides themselves. And then just consider the drama triangles that are embedded in your organization's story, as well as your opposition's story. And often when we compare one side of an issue to the other side, it's literally like you take the drama triangle and just turn it. So especially if you're embarking on a new campaign where maybe you don't have your drama triangle set up yet, it's helpful to look at your opponents and think about how do we want to turn it? How do we want to influence people to see these different characters in a new light? So think about how those drama triangles are similar or different. And then I would encourage folks to also examine which points of intervention feel most relevant to you, which seem to apply best to your area, which maybe have you done before. And then, if you have a few that you can fit into past actions or narratives you've told, maybe think about how you can expand to the other points of intervention and do a wider variety of things. Because I think that's another piece of that tool is just thinking about like, okay, we've done protests before, we've done letter writing campaigns to Congress before, like what is the piece of this that we haven't done? And maybe that's you haven't written a comic book where your villain is an actual villain. That could be a fun way to revive a campaign. And then you want to think about the underlying assumptions in your opponent's narrative that you most want to challenge. So any of those questions really that speak to you at this point, feel free to explore, and then we'll get into the solution room and explore it more as a group. But for now, I ended a little bit early, so let's take 13 minutes and do some individual writing and reflection, and then we'll get folks into groups and work this out more.
Sorry.
So for the solution room activity, each person is going to have 5 minutes to discuss your individual reflections on the drama triangles in your story and the opposition story, potential future interventions you might want to make using the point of intervention tool, and underlying assumptions that you want to challenge. So anything you kind of thought about and journaled about in this break. And then you'll have some time to get inspiration from others' reflections. And basically, as each person is sharing, feel free to request feedback if you want that, or perspective on your own. So folks can kind of set their own boundaries on how much they want people to comment on what they've done or just kind of listen. But feel free to be as collaborative as you want. Collaborative, yeah. And yeah, ask for whatever you think would be helpful to your creative process. So we're going to have, I think, actually a couple minutes extra for this. So the breakdown is about 10 minutes to go through the introductions and read the instructions, 25 minutes for the solution room. Should be about 5 minutes a person, but you can break that up depending on how many people are in your group. And then 10 minutes to build your toolbox. So you'll have about 45, 50 minutes total. We ask that you introduce yourself. Please include your name, preferred pronouns, accessibility needs, land acknowledgement, and your organization. When you're describing the elements of your narrative or your opponent's narrative, make sure you're specific as possible, especially if you're in a group with folks who maybe work on really different areas and need a lot more background. Be clear about which points of intervention feel most relevant to your work and which underlying assumptions you want to challenge. And, ask for help on those things if you need that perspective to get clearer. And just remember, we're thinking through these new tools together. If you're not sure, ask others for help or ideas. Use this time basically however feels best for you and your work.
So just a little bit about privacy. In just a minute, and you'll see if you've already opened the resource folder that there's a bunch of Google Google Docs in there. And you'll see when you get into your room, you'll see a number and then a name of an animal for your team. So then you can go into that Google Doc that is associated with your team. Right now, they're fully editable, but we'll change that after this session so that no one can overwrite anyone else's materials. And just just so you all know, we may use materials from this because we really want to share any things that people have gleaned or that we can share back with the community. The point of a lot of this stuff is to try and open source and share ideas and all of that, but we won't put anyone's names, or if there's anything specific that you don't want us to share with the larger community, it might just be in a blog post or within a guide or something along those lines, then please just email me and let me know so that I don't use that thing. But again, we won't share explicit information or anything along those lines. And the last thing here is if you have any trouble in your breakout room, these are self-facilitated, there is a little button to get help down at the bottom of your screen in your little toolbar. So you can always do that. And then Ian or I can hop in and give you some help or help with technical difficulties. So here you'll see the links to each of the breakout rooms. Again, they're within that folder. I've put them in the chat, but I'll put them in one more time just in case so that you can get to the resource folder. 1 second here. And yeah, we'll just click on one of these links or go into your resource folder, open it up, and I'm going to show you really quickly. Oops, come on. What they look like. So for example, here's Team Kangaroo. And there's a bunch of other resources linked up here in the upper right, including joining our Slack community, seeing the different decks from our last session and this one, as well as some of the other Center for Story-Based Strategy tools. And then also your participant list. So again, everyone is listed there. If you'd like to change your information or delete yourself, it is editable right now, but I will turn off that capability after our session. So please go in and make whatever edits or add whatever information that you would like. But you'll see on your Google Doc an overview that again is the same as the slide we were just looking at, as well as some more in-depth instructions so that you can do your introductions and your group discussion and keep it moving along. Again, having this time to write on your own so that you can then go into the group discussion, hopefully feeling more prepared to have a discussion, but each person take turns. So do one person at a time and hopefully choose a timekeeper to sort of manage your time so that everyone gets their time to discuss their idea and get feedback, should they choose to receive feedback. And then spend the last 10 minutes, choosing one or two highlights that you think would be really helpful for the rest of us to hear, so that when we have our breakout and we come back together, that we can have a discussion around what some of those high-level ideas were. So you have space for notes and things down below. And then we also have some just additional resources that people have found useful over time. So those are down there at the bottom. All right. Any questions before I put everyone into their breakouts? Now it's time for our share out. And we'll, if anyone would like to go first, then I certainly will invite you to do so. Otherwise, we'll go through one team at a time. But if anyone wants to volunteer to go first, then please turn on your mic and join us.
I'll go first with the CAT group.
Great, thank you.
So we had a great group, great discussions. One had to drop off, sadly, because for a staff meeting, but she gave us lots of good food for thought. So one is our clients are the heroes now, not the victims. Previously, our supporters were the heroes. Two is it's not you versus me, it's us versus the problem, as a way so people don't feel like they are the ones being personally attacked. It's like, let's solve these things together. And the other thing was, what are the questions we must ask to push our narrative? So to get people thinking about something and to persuade them rather than telling them. And then what happens when we don't take risks? Why is it okay for startups to fail? Why can't our clients make mistakes instead of being perfect all the time? Our donors are sometimes, wanting people to be perfect all the time. And then we reframed who the villains were. The villains are people we want to win over to our cause. And for our group, there are people we want to donate. So it wasn't villains in a very negative sense. It was just, what are the reasons they may be reluctant to give to our organizations? So how do we reframe the problems that we want to solve to win them over to our cause? So that's it in a nutshell.
Great, thank you. Are there any groups that would like to go next?
I can go next for the Dolphins. So I am going to try to consolidate this the best that I can, but I think the biggest takeaways for us, or the biggest things we wanted to highlight in our group that we were kind of talking about, was reframing the triangle and not just thinking about like changing this narrative of who's considered the victim, but really challenging who's considered the expert when we elevate certain narratives and certain stories. Something that we talked about was shifting the triangle so that those who are traditionally in a position of being a victim are really empowered to share their stories and their allow their voices to be heard as a form of power, and to really shift this culture where it is one of empowerment. I think one thing that we talked about, at least in my organization, which is centered on immigrant rights, is looking at directly impacted communities and considering them experts. We talked a little bit about the difference between how journalism has framed certain narratives and who's considered an expert in media as opposed to in our nonprofit sectors. And then the second highlight is just trying to find more nuanced ways of framing narratives. Again, I think something that we talked a lot about was how COVID-19 has really exposed a lot of the communities that have been most impacted and remain the most vulnerable, and how that can really be a point to elevate and identify those gaps in the opposition's narrative to really point out how COVID has resurfaced these inequalities within our society. And then again, I think that just also allows us to bring forward a narrative that is more intersectional as well. So I think looking at not just what communities are most impacted, but how those intersections overlap. And so it's not just so much of a black and white narrative, but we're really exposing that race, class, gender identity, all of these things are overlapping, and how that can now start to be more centered in our communication.
Okay, thank you so much.
I'm happy to go next.
Okay, thank you.
I think I'm in the elephant room.
Okay.
I feel like we were a little bit more broad ranging in a spirit of wanting to say that the tool can be flexible, and kind of used it from everything from labor rights to organizational change and rebranding of an organization to re-entry work to working with formerly incarcerated women, but really had a shared interest around rights of people who are formerly incarcerated or incarcerated, and largely talked about a reframe at the end about our heroes being people who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, and being able to do that in a context of a society that often is sort of the law and order SVU prosecutor hero society, and how hard it is to do that reframing. And that one of the ways to do that is to elevate the voices of those most impacted. And in our case, in some of the cases, that is the voices of formerly incarcerated Black women. And from some of my organizing, talked about, for people who may know Andrea James, who is the founder of the National Council for Women and Girls, who she talks a lot in my organizing home about right time, right message, right messenger. And that often is actually from a anti-racist lens and working cross-race, and that sometimes will those of us who are white in that organizing home need to bring messages to elected officials, even though in general what we are moving at the direction of formerly incarcerated Black women. There are roles that white allies play. So amazing conversation and networking, and also really useful triangle. And all of those things together were great. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Makiko, thank you.
So I was in the alpaca room, and we had a really good conversation. Our comments, I think we were all working in different areas, but I think we came to a lot of agreement about some general concepts when we think about heroes and victims and who the villains are. And I think we agree that many nonprofits are drivers to want to empower those whose lives we're trying to positively impact. So the victims are often those who are suffering under the structural systems and policies. So if we kind of look at those as the victims, or the status quo that, you know, whether it be, you know, that doesn't maybe care as much about the community, but maybe more corporate driven, or maybe, you know, white supremacy driven, or it could be ageism driven, or, you know, the economic powerhouses versus, or you know, youth of color versus, you know, the society. And but that all of us agree that empowering who was previously considered the victim to be the hero, to give them a voice so that they are listened to for what their struggles are and for the wisdom they have, and actually help support community driven change in whatever it might be, economic development, or you know, empowerment of youth of color, or whether it or people in poverty, or people who are the subject of ageism, or, you know, ableism, or whatever, those kind of things. And that was, I guess, an agreement that we came to. It sounds like other groups had similar kind of things, but that by empowering those who may have perceived themselves to be the victims in the past, that there's just more inclusion and more pluralism, which actually strengthens our society as a whole, rather than those defenders of the status quo who think of it as a zero-sum game. But actually, it's better for everybody when there is more inclusion and embracing the positive aspects of being different, and being willing to, you know, be comfortable with people who are different with you than you, whether it be their age, their color, or their economic circumstances, or whatever. So
Great, thank you. All right, I think we have two more groups. If you each could do about 2 minutes, so that we have a minute to close and kind of run through some of this last stuff.
Sure, I'll go next. My name is Kirsten, she, her pronouns, speaking for the Silkworm Group. We talked a lot about the complexities around this framing, how depending on the framing, you know, things shift. We can shift from heroes to villains amongst each other, and sometimes allies can be working against each other instead of with each other. And how can we have solidarity instead of working in silos and competing with each other? We talked a lot about the theme that's been coming up a lot, how nonprofits fit in the story and don't, I guess, show the communities they serve as the victims, but how they can really be the heroes of the story. And we also talked a lot about the difficulty in naming villains, and kind of just, yeah, the complexities around that. We also talked about how the medium is key to framing the message, with if you're doing a press story or a video or a blog, kind of depends on the audience. And we also talked a little bit about cancel culture and how that's kind of a way where we very quickly name victims and villains. And Adam, if you want to add anything more to that cancel culture statement, he had a lot of thoughts on it, but that's in general what we talked about.
Great, thank you.
In 30 seconds or less, so I want to be mindful of time. I think one of the things that came up that folks have been talking about is just like, when there is no clear-cut villain, or when we want the villain to not be the villain in the story, what do we do? And impacts of community harm. And I think particularly challenging is when harm arises in a community full of corporate campaigners. It's the difficulty in sort of how do we frame and talk about experiences of harm. I think that's probably all I can say in 15, 20 seconds.
Thank you. All right, was there one
I'll
last?
go for Team Panda Armadillo. So we also were focused a lot on the complications around and the flexibility of the drama triangle and how hard it is to kind of define a villain. And really that narratives are extremely susceptible to lived experiences. And that has a huge impact on the stories that we understand. And this is how stories can be framed. And this is particularly important, I think, to recognize as communications professionals, because we can get stuck in our own narratives. And I think one of the things that was really interesting that was surfaced and is part of our community agreement was the idea of not using but using yes and, because it's a very powerful tool to find common ground and find sort of or uncover commonality in the way that people are framing things or understanding things. And that's really important when it comes to working together and having a shared vision.
Great, thank you. All right, in our last minute here, I'm just going to throw up this slide because I want to make sure that we get to some of these very end things, but you'll see that there's a nice link in here. Sorry, Ian, I'm going to kind of just like quickly go through because we're at time. And a thank you for everything. And please fill out the survey. I stuck that in the chat. Ian has just pasted in the chat again the toolkit there for you to find it, Center for Story-Based Strategy. But please take 3 minutes. It's a super quick survey. We really appreciate it. We use all of this information to improve the next roundtables and hopefully find funding for all of this someday. Oops, no, go back. And then the last things here are the upcoming events. We have our next cohort starting in early May. For those who need to hop off, feel free. This is going to take just a minute though. If you do want to join our next cohort, you can use that roundtable code there. And it's 5 sessions, and the org entrance code is usually $850 and you get 50% off. So it's $425 for up to 4 people. And then you'll also see coming up, we have our community roundtable for arming your brand champions. And then the one after that will be focused on data and analytics. And so last piece, a closing activity as we head out today. If you could share one thing in the chat that you want to commit to do in your next narrative intervention. And then thank you all for joining us and your thoughtfulness and your commitment to this work we're all doing together. And it was really a pleasure to have you with us today. Ian, any last?
I'll just say that if folks are interested in learning more about the tools from the Center for Story-Based Strategy that we went over today, we have a lot more tools. We do individual trainings for organizations or specific campaigns. So I just said, feel free to reach out to me. My email and my website are in the chat. Yeah, I would be happy to work with folks on more specific things. And thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here with us. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.